20 weeks, right, in the logic. I'll have more to say about that at the end, but I do consider this a real privilege to be able to do this, so thank you guys for making the journey with me. What I want to do today is, as appropriate, is come back to saying some things that we started the course with, the problematic, the project, and the critiques that we talked about on the very first couple of sessions. So I'll come back to those and talk a little bit about those for just a second. I'll talk about the first two mainly, the problematic and the project, and then we'll come back to the critique at the later when we talk about what's going around, which is the logic and language issues. So we'll come to that, which is obviously in the preface. So we talked about that, and then we'll also talk. How do we do that? Yep. Before we get to the logic and language thing, we'll do logic and nature. Right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So kind of a smorgasbord, a bunch of different stuff. We'll review some things along the way, of course, as well. All right, issues, problems, things you want to talk about before I get going, things I get on to. Don't forget about your papers they're due on the 26th, no later, right? Just send me whatever you have in the file that says Hegel paper, right? If it's finished, great. If it's not finished, that's its condition. That's okay, not a problem. I'd rather you send me something than send me nothing, right? I'm a lot of mincing about that. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because I said there had to be something rather than nothing, right? So get it to me, right? All right. Yeah, I rule by fiat, right? In the classroom. Kind of like God. That's kind of like the Leibnizian God, right? Between the possibilities, I said this thing's with something. Sorry for my Leibnizian fabulation. Will stop. All right. So let's talk first about the problematic of Hegel's thought. Let's go all the way back to that. So I think Hegel throughout his, so I hope this, now I want to return to these issues, right, about what's the fundamental problematic of Hegel's thought, what's the project in the science of logic. And I think that the problematic of Hegel's thought, at least I hope that's what we've been able to see, is him trying to think throughout his mature work, so roughly 1807 on, so publication of the Phenomenology on, he's trying to think nothing other than what he himself calls the necessity of the concept. That's the project. Let's try to think, or that's the problematic. Let's think that. Or perhaps more simply, but perhaps for all that more puzzlingly, as we've seen over the last couple of sessions, he says, I want to think the idea. That is, by which he means, of course, the process of immanent differentiation. I say that, of course, like we all know that now. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but at least the term idea, that's the way he wants to use it, to name this process of immanent differentiation, whereby all things are constituted, so they are, being, and constituted as what they are, essence. Hegel is thus rightly said, I think, to be an idealist, an absolute idealist even, as was Schelling, because he holds not that all reality is a product of mental processes, whether those processes are synthesis, as in Kant, or positing, as in Fichte, so a form of subjective idealism. Not that. But because he contends that all that is, being, really means actuality, is produced by the necessary movement of the concept, a process that is designated by the term idea. So he's an idealist precisely in that strange sense, not an idea in the human mind, but an idea in the sense that it is this process and everything is what it is by virtue of its dependency on that. So everything is this idea in that sense. There's a way in which you could talk about Hegel consistent with that, I think, is another reflection of that, as, and I mentioned this before, I'll just say it again. These may seem like strange bedfellows, but I think they're actually saying the same thing. And that is to call him not only an absolute idealist, but he's also a conceptual realist. Right? He believes the concept is real. It's out there in the world, right, doing this process. All right, so absolute philosophy for Hegel is therefore the complete and determinate comprehension of truth, of what fundamentally is in all its many senses, in their truth, as we talked about last time. And the presentation of that truth, necessarily as a system, we'll come back and talk about that, that is, as an encyclopedia of philosophical sciences, as he was to name the project, or more simply as absolute knowing. That's what we're doing. That's what philosophy is about. It's absolute knowing. Absolute knowing knows the absolute in its truth, rather than in merely representational terms, that is, in contingent relations as expressed in narrative, symbols, images, those of modernity or not, because it knows the absolute in the element, the ether, in which it properly lives, moves, and has its very being. That is, it knows the absolute in the element of the necessity of the concept. The system of truth is thus a system of absolute knowing, and the content of a system of absolute knowing is what Hegel calls, strange phrase, but he loves it, objective thoughts. Objective thoughts. Now, objective thoughts are undeniably concepts, but it is important to note that the concepts that comprise the system of absolute knowing are not standard concepts. Specifically, they are not empirical concepts. They're not generalizations or generalities covering or subsumptive categories. Rather, like the categories in Aristotle or Kant, the objective thoughts of the system of philosophical sciences are the, we could say, meta or foundational first order concepts that set down the rules that set the parameters and make possible the second order empirical and reflective concepts, and importantly, the objects of such determinations. In this sense, then, the concepts of the system can be said, to borrow a distinction from Husserl, to lay down the fundamental formal ontology. That's what I think the logic is. It's Hegel's formal ontology. What it is to be an object as such, which is how Husserl famously defines formal ontology. And then nature and spirit lay down what you could call material ontologies. That is, what it is to be a natural or spiritual object. Those are the formal and material determinations of what in truth is, say, which is the formal and material determinations of the absolute. Now that takes us to and that's a huge, broad stroke view of what's going on in Hegel in general. Now we'll come a little more closer in and look at the project of the science of logic. So that's the problematic, the necessity of the concept and what follows from it. Let's take a look at the project. The science of logic lays out the fundamental elements of a genuinely post-critical, that is post-Kantian metaphysics. More specifically, the science of logic is an ontology of immanent differentiation. So that already puts stakes down for where I think the hermeneutical paradigms have to go, right? This is not a non-metaphysical reading of Hegel. I don't think the text will actually bear that out. It's not to say you can't do that with it, right? You can strip out its metaphysics. You can say these are all just claims about, well, they're objective thoughts. And what we mean by objective thoughts are thoughts that constitute objectivity for us, right? Kind of have, at that point, a Kantian/Fichtean reading of the science of logic, and all these categories are really the categories that are the conditions of the possibility of objects. So objective thoughts in that sense, but their objectivity for us. This is the way someone like a Kant, obviously, or Fichte and others would read this elaboration of categories, right? And I just don't think that the text bears that out sufficiently. It's not to say you can't read it that way, but there's a lot lost, right, in doing so. The other thing I don't think you can do is have a non-systematic reading of the text, right? The text does not bear that out either, right? It demands really a systematic approach to it. So by a post-critical metaphysics, I mean an account of the nature of reality, the metaphysics, and specifically a being as such. So not just metaphysics general, but metaphysics in the sense of ontology. One that has demonstrated that such knowledge, that is knowledge of the absolute, is justified against any and all skeptical challenges, and not simply as Hölderlin and Schelling had it, by an appeal to a special faculty that is supposed to be higher than reason itself. Their standard appeal was something they called either to intellectual intuition or aesthetic sense. That's what they usually appeal to. A grasping of the whole, right? Grasping self-evident grasping of the whole. So at the core of that project then is this idea of the absolute idea. As the concept in its truth, as he says, it's the adequate concept, so the concept in its truth, as the unity of concept and objectivity, what he also calls personhood, Persönlichkeit. So I want to return to that central category, the category of the absolute idea, and just remind us of how much is at stake there for Hegel in that concept, that category, and then where that takes us in terms of the logicality of that idea, which is what we're dealing with in the logic. So he says on page 735, this is page 236 in the German, the absolute idea as the rational concept that in its reality only rejoins itself, only comes back to itself, is by virtue of this immediacy of its objective identity, on the one hand, the return to life, so the return to Leben, he's repeating the last chapter's main topics. On the other hand, it has equally sublated this form of its immediacy, so now he's talking about cognition, and harbors within itself the highest opposition, Gegensätze. It's the move from the immediacy of life to the oppositional structure of cognition. It brings itself into accord with objectivity, brings objectivity into accord with itself. Right? There's the truth problematic and then the good problematic. Now, he proceeds to draw out the implications of what this identity of concept and object actually means for the concept that has now finally come to its end, reached that for which it strives both theoretically and practically, and therefore comes to be itself, comes to be in its truth. Here's what he says about that. Again, this is following after that on page 735, again, 236 in the German. The concept is not only soul. We talked about this passage quite a bit, so I'm not going to come back and redo all of it, but I just want to remind us of the centrality of it. The concept is not only soul, but free subjective concept that exists for itself and therefore has personhood, Persönlichkeit. The practical objective concept that is determined in and for itself and is, as person, impenetrable atomic subjectivity. but which is not just the same exclusive singularity. It is rather universality and cognition, and in its other has its own objectivity for its object. So Hegel's claim is that the concept that contains within itself the opposition of subjectivity and objectivity, as is set forth in theoretical and practical striving, the absolute idea, as he calls it, is not merely, in the logical sense, a living organism. It is not merely, although it is this, life or soul, but again, it's also logically person. Accordingly, Hegel now refers precisely to the expansion and derivation of the entire system of philosophical science. So, as we've talked about before, he broadens out at this moment and says, let's talk about the whole system. Let's talk about everything that's included. We've been in the logic. Let's back out. We're now to the point where here's the subject matter of philosophical science in general. So it encompasses all the logic, nature, and spirit as a whole. So he says this, we talked about this before as well. It, the absolute idea as personhood, is the only object and content of philosophy. Since it contains all determinateness within it, and its essence consists in returning through its self-determination and particularization to itself, it has various or diverse shapes. And the business of philosophy is to cognize, to recognize, to erkennen it, that is, cognize the absolute idea, in these shapes. To see it in nature, to see it in spirit, to see it in logic. So nature and spirit, we could say, are different modes or shapes of the existence of this movement, same movement we've been talking about in the logic. Obviously, in different guises, but nonetheless the same movement. While art and religion, as he says in that passage, are the different modes or shapes through which this process depicts itself to itself, right? This is what art and religion do for Hegel, right? There are ways in which the narratival contingent stories and presentations that have developed in art and religion, they're all forstellum, they're all representational. They all depict this movement back to the culture in which they operate, but also back to us more broadly. Hegel then refers to the derivation of these more concrete domains as he calls this on 735, the last two lines over to 736, 236 to 237 in the German. He calls it the further business of the particular philosophical sciences. So there's him backing out and saying, okay, I've got this entire system that's all about the absolute idea. The absolute idea has different modes. Two of those modes are nature and spirit, and it's the further business of philosophy to lay this, to derive this, these more concrete domains from the absolute idea, and to see the absolute idea in nature, to see it in spirit itself. Now he draws a crucial distinction then here between what he calls the particular philosophical sciences, the philosophical science of nature, with mechanics, physics, and organics, and the philosophical science of spirit, with subjective, objective, and absolute spirit. He delineates those from this book, The Science of Logic. So now he wants to focus in on that, right? So having gone sort of broad, here's what the whole system is. He wants to come back and settle in on, okay, what's the science of logic? So we just talked broadly of what the whole system is studying. The whole system is studying the absolute idea, personhood, in all these various guises, right? Nature, spirit, and logic. Well, what is it that we're studying in the logic? What's the, as he puts it here, the logicality of the idea? The logicality of the idea. Now, the short answer to that question, as we saw last week, is method. Right? Method. And, there's a temptation, we talked about this last week, I just want to remind us all of this. There's a temptation to say, okay, well, we're talking about method, so what that means is, here's the form that you can then apply to nature, that you can then apply to spirit to correctly and properly understand. Right? This is the way in which you would think about method in Aristotle, the way you would think about it in Descartes, the way you would think about it in Spinoza, the way you think about it still, frankly, in Kant. Right? Kant says at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, when he's talking about methodology, he says, what our task is in the critique, in both the analytic and the dialectic functions of it, is to do what? Is to assess the materials for building an edifice of knowledge. To assess the materials for the building of an edifice of knowledge. Can we build the Tower of Babel, he says. This is Kant. Can we build the Tower of Babel reaching up to God in the heavens? Answer, no. Why? The materials don't allow it. Right? What we know is only things as they appear for us and the necessary conditions thereof. And that just won't allow us to get to the thing in itself, God. So the Tower of Babel, which is shorthand in Kant for all prior dogmatic metaphysical projects, right? Leibniz, Spinoza, Wolff, everyone else. That's what they wanted, to have a Tower of Babel, but they never inspected the building materials to see if they could actually get there. So Kant, in one of his, Kant could write. I mean, when you read the First Critique, you don't often think that, but he actually, some of the shorter essays, he does engage in this writing more fluid style of writing. It's very clunky in most of the critique. It's not better in German, by the way. When you read it in German, it's just that clunky. In fact, a lot of Germans famously read the English translations to try to figure out where the period, at least where you could put a period, right? Because he famously goes on for pages, semicolon, 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 without, okay. So you just read an 800-page book, which is horrible, right? So I'm not trying to make Hegel better by comparison. It's not. But it's just a fact, right? But he could turn these phrases, and you look at on the doctrine of method at the end of the First Critique, and he says there, we aspire, I'm paraphrasing, but the central image is there. We aspire to build a Tower of Babel, but we needed to inspect the building materials to see if we could do such a thing. And what we find out is that we can't. All we can build, but this is everything, he says, all we can build is a dwelling place on the plane of experience. A dwelling place on the plane of experience. What is that dwelling place? As I see it in Kant, it's got two floors, right? One is the empirical cognition floor. We can do empirical cognition. We can know things in their contingency and their accidentality, right? All that can be done. But fortunately, we also have a second floor. That second floor is where you can do genuinely critical metaphysics for Kant, right? Because you can know things as they are in their necessity for us, right? That what they must be in order to be for us at all. So we can know without ever experience intervening, though we're building on the plane of experience. We can know before the plane of experience intervenes at all, we can know, well, for it to be on the plane of experience, it's got to be somewhere in some when, space and time. It's got to be quality, quantity, relation, modality, or otherwise it couldn't show up there. All that's the building materials for a genuinely critical metaphysics for Kant. So we can't do the Tower of Babel. We're not going to get to God. Sorry. We're not going to know God. We can believe things about God for reasons otherwise, but we can't know things about God. But the edifice of knowledge that we can have, the dwelling place on the plane of experience, is possible for us. Hegel's clearly saying that prohibition, right, was premature. The prohibition that we can't build the Tower of Babel is premature. He's clearly saying we can know the in itself. We can know the absolute. We can know God. So if you put it in that kind of framework that Kant gives us of the edifice, the dwelling place on the plane of experience versus the Tower of Babel, Hegel's a lot closer to the Tower of Babel, but he doesn't think the Tower of Babel's out there. That you're trying to get to God, right? Out there. What you're trying to do is see that the in itself is immanent within experience itself. It's available to us, right? We prematurely foreclose that area of inspection. And what this book and the rest of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences the rest of the system is an exploration of precisely that terrain, the terrain that had been sectioned off from us by the border policing of the First Critique. So when we say we're looking after metaphysics, post-critical metaphysics, that is, I take it, what he's doing. Now that's the big project. So Hegel wants to come back and say, okay, if that's the big project, that the business of philosophy is to know the in itself, and to know the in itself in terms of nature, not nature as it is for us, but nature as it is in itself, spirit not as it is for us, but as it is in itself, then what does it mean that the logic knows being, essence, concept in themselves? What's the logicality of the idea? Well, we've already seen quite repeatedly in this book, we've said, well, there's a sense of life that's natural, there's a sense of life that's spiritual, but there's a sense of life that's logical, right? We try to delineate that out. We do the same thing with cognition, right? We say, well, there's a sense of cognition that's clearly spiritual. You can even talk about a kind of naturalistic cognition as well. But here we're looking at its logical sense. And roughly that's meant in each case, though in different ways, ontological, right? That's really what that's turned out to mean. Well, what does the logicality of the idea mean? Because he's making a similar kind of operation here. So what is the logical sense, as he calls it, the logicality of the absolute idea? And he says very clearly, it's nothing other than form. And again, we would think, oh, okay, we know what form is. It's like what Kant was talking about. You gotta assess the materials, and then you can, then you can go and see if you can build the edifice or not. Well, that means that you're engaging in a kind of form that can be applied to matter that's received from without. you apply it in various different sectors. That's precisely not how Hegel thinks of method or form. So look at what he says here. He says is that the logicality of the absolute idea is nothing less than the setting out of the form, he's going to eventually call this the method, with which all particular sciences must accord. All right, so it's philosophical methodology, philosophical method. It's form. So far, so good. There's a sense in which you could say Hegel's a deeply, deeply, and profoundly a formalist. But notice what he does with form. So insofar as you have expositions of the absolute idea in all the particular sciences, here I'm talking about the particular sciences of nature, science of philosophical science of nature, philosophical science of spirit, they all have to accord with, they're all derivative from, they have to accord with the logical sense. So the logical has a strange priority here with regard to the other sciences. It's the form that they all must accord with. So the logicality of the idea is really about the methodology. And if you just say that, right, if you just leave it at that point, right, you could say, oh, okay, well then it does fit into the standard Aristotelian, Cartesian, Spinozistic, whatever, understanding of long history of understanding of form, because all we mean by that is all the various other sciences, whether it's the philosophical science of nature, the philosophical science of spirit, they just have to adopt the same form, right? The same methodology. And if they adopt the same methodology, then they're good. And I think that's exactly right, except for Hegel doesn't mean methodology in the sense that you apply it on something that's extrinsic to it. Because what he immediately says, this is on page 737, you can back it up and see it on 736, but they're on 737, is this claim, which I take to be sort of the announcement of the end of the logic proper, in one sense, or at least that's too much, the announcement of the end of the logic in terms of the derivation of all that follows from it. Now we're just going to focus on what's entailed by that. So he says there on 737, this is 238 in the German, the concept is all. I take that to be the conclusion of the logic. And what that means is that the concept is not just the conceptual form of everything. It's not your standard garden variety concept. Let's remind ourselves, right? That's a wholly crazy state, preposterous claim to make, right? If you think about concept is in a formal sense, right? You think of it as a generality. You think of it as a covering law, right? Something that can subsume or can have instances, things like that. Or if it's born within things, it's inherent within them. All those standard ways of thinking about, as we called it, universality, can't work. Won't work to make sense of this, because when you say the concept is everything, it's all, what you're talking about is it's not that which can subsume everything, but you're literally saying it is everything that you touch, right? It has that kind of Spinozistic sense of what do we mean by substance? Welcome to everything. And everything is this. This is his replacement, for lack of a better term. And the concept is a process. So, and on Hegel's read of Spinoza, not the best reading of Spinoza, by the way, but his reading of Spinoza, substance is dead. Spinoza. This is his accusation constantly. I know we have that wonderful conatus, and we're all excited about that, and it's got all sorts of vitalistic senses going on in it, wonderful, good, and great. But Hegel thinks that that's all mechanistic. Because when you look at Spinoza, that's the only way he has to explicate what the movement of conatus in all things is. It's mechanical movement. That's his only way of accounting for it. And so this way of thinking about this process is just not possible there. Concept is everything is that. And he says, and its movement, just continuing on with that claim, right? The concept is all. And its movement is the universal absolute activity, the self-determining and self-realizing movement. It's literally everything, and everything is in process of movement. And we know what that process is, law, the structure of that movement is. He says then that the logicality of the absolute idea is thus method. Now, the centerpiece of that claim, which he then goes on to explicate at 736, and following that paragraph there, which we went through last time, so I'm not going to take it step by step through that, but that central idea is, here's the real key moment, right, is to say that form engenders its own content. Form engenders its own content. This to me, I think it's true to Hegel. Hegel thinks that that's the central idea of the logic. I mean, it's in some ways it's underwhelming, right? Because you say, oh, well, form just generates its own content. Not that, when you say it like that, it's not that complex an idea. It's not that perplexing an idea, at least as it's stated. But it's, I think, pretty revolutionary to say that form is not that which can be applied, imposed, subsumes content within itself, but is actually generative of the concept, of content itself. So form generates its own content. That's, Hegel takes it himself at this point, to be the central, when he says the concept is everything, concept is all, the form, concept, generates everything that exists. So at the most fundamental basic level, ontological level, everything that is by virtue of the movement of the concept. It wouldn't be if it weren't product of the concept, and it is the concept precisely in that sense, because what the concept generates doesn't stand over against it, separate from it. It is, it can be extracted that way, but in its truth, these things are going to be in their truth, then they don't stand over against it. They are born within it, literally B-O-R-N-E, born within it, right? Yeah, John, you had a comment.
Yeah, just actually, so then Hegel's other works are attempt to see whether or not the content is in accord with that form that has engendered it?
I think not.
No.
Because that would still have the concept, have the form be something that's empty or somewhat extractable from the content itself. I think what the project of the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit is to see the absolute idea in those modes. And to see the absolute idea in those modes means to see how the concept engenders nature and how it engenders spirit. Which, if you look at the opening paragraphs of both of those accounts, philosophy of nature and philosophy of spirit, it's exactly what he does. And then everything else follows from that, right? Because the concept is everything. So I think you could say, well, is the content in accordance with? But that's asking a kind of correspondence question. Right? And I think he's acknowledging that you can do correspondence claims, but what's made those possible is the material truth of the operations of the concept and its process and how it engenders things. And that's what things have got to be measured against. Is that. That's what it means to find, that's the business of philosophy when he says to know the absolute idea in these other modes. Is that helpful with that? I mean, it's contestable, let's be clear, right? And when you go in and read the philosophy of nature, you go in and read the philosophy of spirit, these are the initial hermeneutical problems, or how are we to read this, right? How are we to think about the relationship in the philosophy of nature? How do we think about the relationship between the philosophical science of nature, so Naturphilosophy, and how do we think about that in relationship to empirical sciences, right? And then how do we think about that in terms of the philosophy of spirit, which also has an empirical account. You can do psychology in an empirical way, right? So how do we think about the relationship between empirical anthropology, psychology, and so forth, in relationship to those, right? So that's the problem in each one of those sciences. But it is, I think, the claim born out of here that those are the quest, both of those, the search for both of those, is to find the absolute idea in that matter, see it, to recognize it. Is that useful? Do you want to come back?
I guess just a slightly different question is, I keep getting hung up on why is the claim that the concept is all, not just the tautological claim of everything is everything, or like why is it not the night where all cows are black?
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, his claim is at this point that the concept's been shown to have to be a process, that it is a process that's rule governed. And because it's a process that rule governed, it's not equatable with everything, even though it gives rise to everything, even though it's not separable from everything. Right? It's distinguishable without being separable, extrinsic to them. So I don't think it's a tautology in that sense, right? I think the concept designates or denotes something that's different than simply everything that exists. It is in and gives rise to everything that exists, but it's not reducible to everything that exists. This is similar to, though not the same thing, I'll do the Spinoza reference one more time as though the obscure helps the obscure, but it's the difference between natura naturata and natura naturans, right? This is where Spinoza says there is this, the nature, right, substance, is this thing that gives rise to all the things that we call natural entities, the natura naturata. right? So then turn out rot to wrongs is that process. Well, that's what it would be, a process of Hegel.
That is helpful.
That's a distinction without an extrinsic differentiation. Yeah, I mean,
Yes. I'm struggling to see the his description of the method and philosophical method. If form engenders its content, is this what everything that is the concept does in the realm of being, or is this the gaining that philosophical method gives us? I think it's both. But then, what's the difference between the solution of the either or logic of the form and content in view of religion and art? He said content is the same, form is distinguished in philosophy. So what happens in the form that in religion and arts that doesn't lead to philosophy?
yeah. So this is an excellent question. I won't be able to treat it in the kind of depth that it really deserves. So I'm going to give you a surface level answer to a much better and deeper question than I can get to here. Maybe anyway. But his claim, just so everybody's on the same page about this, his claim about art and religion is that they have the same object as philosophy. They're all talking about the absolute, right? All the various ways of thinking about art, all the various ways in which you practice religion, practice art, they're all about the absolute. And philosophy is obviously about the absolute in the sense that we're talking about. But what's different about art and religion vis-a-vis over against philosophy, what's different about art and religion, is that they are a form not in accord with its content. A form not in accord with its content. Why is it not in accord with its content? Well, because its form presents the absolute either in purely pictorial images, and by virtue of that, always borders on rigidifying. So he thinks the struggle with painting for him is always, right, that it results in something that stays into itself. Now there are other art forms, right? Poetry, of course, is the ultimate for him in a lot of ways for this reason, that flow, right? They move, they have a movement in them. And so that's better, right, at getting what, in for you're depicting, representing this process, this movement, but it's always a contingent flow, a contingent process. It happened to happen this way, right? It's the flow of these particular words leading to these other terms, poetry in that sense. Religion has a similar problem. Its form is out of accord with the object, because the object it wants to present in all the various forms of religion, forget talking about how Hegel seems to be obsessed with Christianity, just look at all the various different forms of practices of religion. He would say all of them are out of accord with their object because they always present their object in terms of narratival presentations, right? Stories. They're always about stories, not the absolute. And so that applies to the Greek and the Romans, whether we're talking about them or whether they're talking about Christianity. They're all storytelling religions of some form. That's what he thinks religion is: storytelling, making sense of the world in terms of stories. And he doesn't denigrate them because they do that, but he thinks that's out of accord with the nature of the concept. Because why? It's not necessity. It's not necessity. This is always what he comes back to, right? Always at the end of the day, the break point, as far as I can tell, between genuine philosophical cognition and other forms of cognition is the question of the necessity of the concept. And it's about, why does this follow from that? Well, if it follows from that by virtue of anything else other than imminent development, then it's not necessity. Does that help make some sense about it? So I want to leave that there, right? We talked last time about the what I call Hegel doesn't call it this, so let's be clear, but the epistemological and ontological implications of that claim that the concept is everything. The epistemological side of it means that now we are authorized to use, that's why it comes at the end, we are now authorized to use this method, and we're about to hear what the method is in just a second, be reminded of it. We'll be able to see that in everything, and we'll be rightful in seeing that in everything. By what right do we use this? The epistemological question post-Kant. By what right do we claim this about these things? Well, because everything is at its core, at its bottom, ontological level, that is what it is. So it's right to see it in these structures, right? This is not foisted upon them. It's not imposed. This isn't Hegel's method, right? He doesn't, as I've said, caricaturing this at the beginning of class, he doesn't dialecticize anything, right? What could be more anathema to him? He's not trying to impose anything on anything else. He really thinks that there's processes that are going on out there that it's our job as philosophers to recognize and to have insight into, but those processes we know through the ontological investigation we've carried out in the logic. So we're now entitled to say, well, nature's dialectical, not because Hegel's, into dialectics, but because that's the nature of nature. Nature operates. That's how spirit operates. How everything operates. Not a surprise to them. They operate in different ways about this, right? They're not all the same mode, but they all are the same absolute idea, the same process. So that's the epistemological payoff, right, you could say. And he talks about this. This is on 737 to 738. I'll go back through the details there. 737 to 738, 238 to 239 in the German, where he says, the concept is all, and then goes through all these various claims about it. The method is therefore to be acknowledged as the unrestrictedly universal internal and external mode. It's not like any other mode. It's not any other way of knowing. It's not the natural or the spiritual. It's not restricted in those senses. It belongs to all. And unrestrictedly means it has no boundaries. So here's, as I alluded to earlier, Kant famously presents the first critique, the process of critique, as border policing. He does this in the preface to the first edition or the second, I forget which, the A or the B preface. But he presents critique as border, it's in the A preface, presents it as border establishment and policing, right? Really at borders. What we can know and what we can't know. I mean, it makes sense, right? He says the problem with all prior metaphysics is Kant. The problem with all prior metaphysics is that they didn't respect that boundary, right? They thought you could know things as they are in themselves. That's where things have gone wrong. That's why metaphysics is at a shambles. That's why it's been irrepressibly contestable, and we've not made any advance whatsoever. We're the laughingstock, right? Whereas there has been genuine advancement made in other fields, like natural science and mathematics, for example, but we haven't made any advance in the project of metaphysics because we haven't respected those boundaries. Well, Hegel wants to say not trash those boundaries. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, okay, but let's examine those boundaries. This is the project of the phenomenology. Let's examine those boundaries and see if we are required to be restrained by them. Can we or can we not actually know the thing in itself? Can we not know the absolute? Kant tells us, well, let's this is the hypothesis of the first critique. Let's see if things don't go better. This is the A and B preface, he does it again. Let's see if things don't go better if we try things where all they have to do is conform to us, not as they are in themselves. Let's see if we don't make more advance. And you can read the phenomenology from Hegel as saying, yeah, well, let's see if we can actually know things in themselves. We really haven't tried that out. And of course, the retort from all Kantians is, well, 2,000 years we tried it out that way. It didn't work. It's a massive disaster. And Hegel wants to say, oh, let's go one time, once more to the breach. Right? Let's see if we can make it happen. Let's see if we can do it. And his claim is that it works, right? That we can know things as they are themselves. That's absolute knowing, right? We can know things in themselves. And here's the fruits of doing that. So these, when he says unrestrictedly, right, it's precisely the kind of sense of which, there are boundaries that have been put in place, legitimate boundaries, he'll say, right? Hegel would say, but untested and therefore dogmatic, unwarranted perhaps boundaries. We need to explore them and test them. Boundaries are not true because you just put them in place. That's dogmatism, right? So this demand from Kant, this is sort of paradoxical. This demand from Kant that we be humble. This is the famous Kantian humility, right? That we don't know things as they are in themselves. Back off, you don't know things as they are in themselves. Hegel's point is, well, is humility warranted here? Right? Maybe we do know things as they are. So here's a book of explicating what we know in itself. He then says, this is still on 737 to 738, anything whatever, kind of crazy language, it's completely expansive. Anything whatever is comprehended and known in its truth. Okay, so, that seems like an ambition we want to have, right? Knowing anything whatsoever in its truth, not just knowing it, but knowing it as it properly is in its truth. That phrase, we talked about that notion of truth, not as I'm going to get my judgments right about the state of affairs that exists beyond them, but to know them as they accord with the concept itself. Anything whatever is comprehended and known, so grasped, we grip it, we know it, we grasp it, we conceptualize it. and known in its truth only when it is completely subjugated to the method. Subjugated makes it sound like, well, it's subsumption, right? It's imposition. Look at what he says right after this semicolon. It is the method proper to. I'm not imposing it. It's the method that belongs to. It's proper to every matter, every zaka, because its activity, the activity of this method, is the concept. And I don't know if you have heard recently, concept is everything. So we don't have to foist it on it whatsoever. Now, that leads us to his account of the ontological payoff of that. That's the epistemological side, right? Now we've got authorization to use the concept's structure as the methodology without restriction of everything and knowing everything in its truth. He then says, this is pages 738 to 750. This is the discussion of method directly, 239 to 250 in the German. And he identifies these two moments. That's where he picks them out, right? He's got 1, 2, and the first one is beginning. All he means by beginning is you begin always with immediacy, indeterminacy. Well, does that mean we always begin with being and its indeterminacy? No. It means that every beginning that you take up, whether it's the beginning in the logic, which is to begin with being, or the one you begin with in nature, which is to take nature in its immediacy, or to take spirit in its immediacy, the beginning of the spirit, or you're focused on, absolute spirit. What's absolute spirit in its immediacy? What's physical being in its immediacy? So you could talk about it in the grand scheme of things. It applies at that level, at the meta level, if you want to put it in this term. But it also applies at the sub levels as well. So you begin with immediacy. And he says very clearly, I want to go back to this because it's something we've talked about several times, and I just want to highlight it one last time. He says, this is on page 740, right at the end of the paragraph, coming over from 739. This is page 241 in the German. The advance is not, therefore, a kind of superfluidity or overflow, Überfluss. This is what it would be if that which is at the beginning were in truth already the absolute. I love that line because it's Hegel saying, look, the absolute is not secretly buried there, and all we have to do is analytically unpack it. We're going to do some analytic work. He's going to talk about that in the progress side, right? We talked about this last week. It's an unpacking, right? But the unpacking for him is not of what's buried there, and we're just pulling it all out. It's not like secretly we all knew on day one, being, nothing, becoming. That's the movement of the concept. Now, looking back on it, right, we do know that. But at first, we're not entitled to that, even if you know it when you go back and look at it. So even as you go back and present it now, you're not entitled to go and say about it, oh, being, nothing, becoming. Let me tell you the secret of what's going on. It's determinate negation. That's what's happening. Oh, solves all mystery. No, the hell it does. Right? It violates precisely the immanence of the development. So it would violate the analytic as Hegel understands the knowledge that's going on there. It's analytically developing because it's immanent. But he says that's also its synthetic nature. Determinate negation is what puts things into this synthetic relation with one another. So the advance there is not a kind of superfluidity and overflow. This is what it would be if that which is at the beginning were in truth already the absolute. It's not already the absolute. He says the advance consists rather in this, that the universal determines itself and is the universal for itself, that is equally a singular and a subject. Only in its consummation, its fulfillment, is it the absolute. Only here do we get to the absolute. We didn't secretly always already, been tracking it along the way. So that leads him from beginning, which advances how? Purely by virtue of its deficiency, its negativity, right? Its immediacy is its motor. Right? Its defect is what moves it beyond itself, right? What it lacks, to put it in that term, that kind of language, is precisely what moves it beyond itself. It's not just something that's inadequate to it, that's true, but its inadequacy is what moves it beyond that status, that alone, right? Not it being measured against something that's adequate. So, think about the standard ways in which this is done in the history of philosophy. We always think about, well, there's adequate ideas and inadequate ideas. This is Descartes. Adequate ideas and inadequate ideas, and we measure them against what? Adequate ideas, right? Because we have an idea of what's perfection, and everything else is privation from that. And those are the inadequate ideas, by more privation, by more privation. Hegel is saying the exact opposite. Things are what they are by virtue of their privation. And they move beyond themselves by virtue of that privation. So we don't already have the great chain of being in place. And then we measure the lower on the chain, the lower rungs of the chain against the higher rungs of the chain, the classical way in which the Porphyrian tree would tell us to operate with the great chain of being. And others would as well. I mean, this is not just Porphyry's thing, but it's a lot of history of philosophy. But Hegel's saying, no, actually it generates itself out of the most simples, and they generate themselves because they're simple, because they're inadequate to themselves. They're immediate. Their negativity is not foisted upon them and not measured against something that they lack. So this is why lack is always a weird term to use there, because lack always suggests, well, it's being measured against something greater than it. And Hegel's denying that there's something greater than it already there. So he's saying that this deficiency, this indeterminacy, this negativity, to give it another term, is what generates its own otherness. And that's what he means by the second moment, right? Progression. So he doesn't have some wildly sophisticated sense of methodology here. Rule 1, rule 2, rule 3, none of that. No procedure list you need to go through and check off, and stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 you need to work through. He just simply says, look, whatever you've got, look at it at what stage it's at. If it's in its immediate stage, then take that for what it is. And then look and see, okay, what is its immediate stage? Correctly analyze that. Then see what's, if anything, there's deficient about it, because as immediacy, it'll most likely have something deficient about it. It will have something deficient about it. And see how that generates its own determinacy. So where it begins the journey of generating its own determinacy. Latch onto that. Don't look at it as privation. Don't look at it as something that's missing and you want to make up for it. Look at it as the driver of determinacy itself, the creator of determinacy itself. So in the progression account, this is where he starts talking about where you have first and second negation. So now negativity is doing all the work, right? Negativity is driving you from the first negation that's already born within the immediacy to the second negation, which is the negation of that first negation, right? And then he says, well, once you've got the othering of something, first negation, you've got now its second negation, that is, it's other, but that is going to other itself. So now you've got third and fourth. And he says, we can get in a numbers game if you want to about this. We can start looking at the various stages of this and say, this is first, that's second, third, fourth. And he says, but the real point of the matter is that determinate negation is driving progression. And that's because that's not something we demand of things to be in accord with our methodology, which is extrinsic to ontology. But this is just a recognition of how things are insofar as they are at all. This is the movement of the concept now read as the form engendering its content by which everything is to be understood. Then finally, he does not number it 3, but I think there is a third moment of the discussion. We can talk about that if you like. This really begins, as we said, on page 747, 752 in the English, and then 248 to 252 in the German. And what he says there is basically this, that if you let the beginning develop through this progression, which is both at once analytic and synthetic, because it's determinate negation through and through, it's immanent differentiation. So analytic, immanent, determinate negation gives you the synthetic moment of relating constantly and determining it constantly from one concept to another. Notice another comparison with Kant, just for the moment, the analytic and synthetic. Think about the synthetic in Kant. Kant always thinks about the synthetic as a result of judgment, right? How do you get two things not connected together, right? That's always the problem in Kant. How can you have genuinely synthetic knowledge where the subject is not simply repeated in the predicate, but something different and new is in the predicate? You don't just repeat something in the predicate. That's when you have genuine synthetic knowledge. And then when that's a priori, when that's condition of possibility, then you've got genuinely synthetic a priori knowledge. You've got metaphysics, yay, right? But Hegel's not trying to relate concepts to one another through predication. And he's already shown us that judgment really buries the work of negativity in the copula. So he would say what looks to be merely judgmental structures, you have them in Kant, really turn out to be syllogistic structures. The structure of life itself, as he would eventually say, this disjunctive movement. And that's really what's doing the connecting there, linking one concept to the next, unfold into the truth. And he says, once you have that, you have what he calls it this on the bottom of 748, you have what he calls it there, the deduction or proof of the content. The deduction or proof of the content. Now, I want to stop on that word deduction and proof for just a moment, because those are not innocently invoked terms in the context of post-Kantian philosophy. You don't get to say deduction and say it innocently, right? Because, as we all know, if you've read the First Critique, you know one of the centerpieces of that book, it has many, but one of the centerpieces of that book is a deduction of the categories. So when Hegel goes back and picks out that particular term and says, what we've just carried out is the deduction of these categories, it has more force than simply the premises are true, therefore of necessity the conclusion follows, which is our standard deductive way of thinking about things. It invokes a particular model, a law court model, that Kant had put there and said, look, when I think about deduction, this is Kant in the First Critique, this is the B edition of the First Critique. Kant says there famously, look, what we need is the deduction of the categories. And by deduction, he says, I mean not simply the proving of these concepts, but a particular way of proving them, like they do in the law courts. Well, how do you use the deduction in the law courts? He says, very specifically, you're trying to establish the entitlement of someone to a piece of land. That's when you need the deduction. You need the deduction when you want to prove somebody's title to a land claim they're making, a property claim they're making. That's weird. How can that work? That's not our standard logical sense of deduction. It's related to it in some ways, but it's really quite different. What's that got to do with what he's doing? Kant in the First Critique, I'll come to Hegel in just a moment. And Kant says, well, look, what I want to think about is the way in which the categories are making a claim on the land of experience. And are they entitled to make that claim? And the way you do that when you're talking about the empirical deductions that go on in law courts is you go back and you say, okay, show me where you bought the piece of land. Show me where it was bequeathed to you. Show me the title was handed over to you. Give me the history of how you acquired it, how you came into legitimate acquisition and ownership of this piece of land. That's how we do it in the law courts. We ask for a paper, we look for the title records. Right? Where'd you come in to hold this? Where did it get transferred to you? So either you're the originary owner, where did you take stake in it? Where did you lay claim to it? How'd that happen? Or you're a secondary owner to it. It got sold to you or bequeathed to you in some way. Where did that happen? You have to have records of that. So we'll look for that. That's how you establish the deduction, the title to the land. So Kant in the First Critique picks that idea up and says, okay, look, we're going to do that for the categories. How do you do that? You don't do an empirical deduction of the categories. That's right? Kant famously says, we're not interested in the quid facti question, right? We're not interested in the question of what was the case. That's what you're interested in the law court. We're interested in the quid juris question. By what right do you own this stuff? And the only way you can show that is to show that these categories are the, no surprise here, conditions of the possibility of having experience at all. If you can show that, which is what the deduction does in so many steps, is it shows you that those categories are rightly entitled to the ownership of experience because they are the conditions of the possibility of acquiring experience itself. You wouldn't have experience without them. So they are entitled to be owning of experience itself. That's roughly how the deduction works principally in the B deduction, but it works that way arguably in the A deduction as well. So when Hegel picks up that term, he knows that history. And so when he says that here, look, he's reserved that. He doesn't trot that word out and say, we need a deduction of the quality into quantity. We need a deduction of quantity into measure. He doesn't throw the word around like that. He'll say there's a derivation of this that necessarily entails it. He's using the logical derivational language all the time. Right? So he does think that the analysis of a concept into its own determinacy, into its own determinate negation does entail, right? So it's fine to use that language, logical entailment. And therefore you could derive the next concept from it. And that concept will be what it is, what that first concept was in its truth. So that's the language of, one thing is the truth of the thing that came prior to it. It's the retrogressive ground, all those ways of expressing it. But when Hegel picks up this term at the end of the book, invokes this term at the end of the book, I take him to be saying, and this is a huge, massive claim, but if it helps, it helps. If it doesn't, then toss it away. I think what he's saying is that what I sought to do in the science of logic was correct and redo the deduction of the categories. It took me 800 pages. It took Kant 10. But that's because Kant, took shortcuts. He didn't actually go through the categories. Remember, famous moment in both the deductions, particularly in the B deduction. Kant famously just says, and here all the categories apply. Woo! All of a sudden, without examining any of them, it's just, we couldn't have space-time in the category. We couldn't have experience without space-time in the category. So therefore, how do we have one world? We have one world because we have one cognizer of that one world. How do you stitch together one world out of all the various representations? In accordance with the categories. There you go. You acquire experience through the category. Well, Hegel wants to say, okay, no. We're not doing the phenomenal numinal divide thing. We're not doing this. We don't know if we got reality itself. We don't know if we got things in themselves. Let's just look at the categories and see what they entail. Notice the basic overarching structure of the objective logic is quality, quantity, relation, modality. So we revisit and go back through all those. And then the concept turns out to be the replacement for something like the transcendental unity of apperception. He literally says so at the beginning, but now not in the subjectivistic sense, the mind doing it, but the concept is this doing these things. There he goes, and now we know what the logic of that is in the subjective concept. We know how it actually fabricates the world, right? Objectivity, and we now know what that is to be immanent within objectivity itself, the idea. So he calls that a deduction or proof of the content. And he says at that moment you have, this is on 749, he introduces it by talking about negativity right at the middle of the page, or a little bit up above the middle of the page. And then right at the end of that page on 749, it's 250 in the German, he says, you have a system of totality. A system of totality. So when you have this kind of deductive proof structure going on, where it gives rise to the analytic synthetic interrelationship of all these categories with one another, what you have constructed, to use the term that both Hegel and Schelling used repeatedly in their time when they were in line with one another. They would say the job of philosophers is to construct a system. It's a technical term for them. They borrowed it from Kant. Kant used it, but didn't use it quite as technically as they did. Schelling and Hegel both thought it was a technical term. You need to literally build, put together, construct a system. So if you're constructing a system, you construct it through determinate negation. Right? Schelling thinks you constructed, and so did early Hegel, through intellectual intuition, or what Hegel called transcendental intuition. This is in the different shrift. It's also in Faith and Knowledge, where you have this transcendental intuition of all things, and then you build out of it, right, the various parts, the various systems out of it. Here Hegel's saying, no, there's no grasping of the whole. You start with indeterminacy and you see where that takes you. This is where it takes you. And all that follows from it, if you won't get in the way of it, and you'll be adamant of holding true to it, whether he did so or not, certainly something we can question and examine, but that's at least the ambition, then what you have at the end of it is a genuine system of totality. So systematicity is the mark of something that has been deductively proved. So when you construct a system through determinate negation, you demonstrate the truth of its various parts, and that is the building of the system itself. Now, he also has there, that same place, this notion of the circle of circles. So whenever he invokes systematicity, he almost always will have aligned with that this notion of circularity, right? And as I said last time, one way of thinking, I think the proper way, and you're about to see one reason why I think that's the case, is that you can't think circularity there as the beginning simply coming back to itself in the end, right? A system that, a circle that closes back wholly and completely on itself. Why not? Because you come back at the end to the beginning, absolutely, we're about to, right? That's what's about to happen. He's about to, the last 2 pages of the logic are, we've now returned to being. But not being as we started with. Being with a difference. Being now is fulfilled. Here's what he says. Take a look at this on This is on page 752. Sorry to throw you around through all these pages so quickly, but I'm going to settle down these last two pages now. 752, he says this on, and here's the problem. 752, this is the first full paragraph down. So the logic also has returned. Everybody see where I'm at? So he's just been telling you, right? It's the circle of circles. So if you look on page 751, right, it's where he says, by virtue of the nature of the method just indicated, the science presents itself as a circle that winds around itself, where the mediation winds the end back to the beginning, which is the simple ground. The circle is thus a circle of circles. So he's invoking all this circularity imagery for each single member. Sorry.
Yeah, the German. Sorry.
Yeah, it's 252.
Thanks.
For each single member ensouled by the method is reflected into itself, so that in returning to the beginning is at the same time the beginning of a new member. Fragments of this chain are the single sciences, each of which, top of page 752 now, is the before and an after, or more accurately said, has in possession only the before, and its conclusion points to its end. So there, sort of him saying, a system is always circular in this way. It comes back to its beginning and its end. Then he says, so the logic. So now he's saying, okay, the logic is the system, right? So what's it doing? It's going back to its beginning. So the logic also has returned in the absolute idea to this simple unity, which is its beginning. What's that? He reminds you, literally page 1, so to speak, of the logic. The pure immediacy of being, in which all determination appears at first as extinguished or removed by abstraction, is the idea that through mediation, that is, the sublation of mediation, has come to the likeness corresponding to it. Now, what do we start with? Being, pure being, vacuous, empty, nothing. What that means, if it's nothing, then nothing is. Let's count we have at the beginning. But now we haven't departed really from that. The whole book has been about that, he's saying. So in the absolute idea, we were all unpacking analytically and synthetically what it is to be. But then he says this. The method is the pure concept, right, that only relates to itself. Okay, we've got that. Concept is everything. The concept is this process of universality particularizing itself into otherness that comes back to itself in singularity. Okay, great. And then he says, the method is a pure concept that only relates to itself. It is therefore the simple self-relation, which is being. Now, if you stop there, you would say, oh, I got it. We're back at pure immediacy again, right? We're back at pure indeterminacy, vacuous, empty, being pure being. That's where we've returned. If in the end we came back to the beginning as the beginning originally was, if it's really is a closed circle, then we would be done at that. But that's not what he says, because that's not what's happened. Look at what he says. But it, talking about being, now is also, and you have fulfilled concept, yes? That's still, I have no earthly idea why that's the translation, because in German it's fulfilled being. Seems significantly different. He says, but now it is also fulfilled, not the, but fulfilled being, erfüllte sein, right? Fulfilled being. We didn't have fulfilled being, right? That's precisely what being wasn't at the beginning of the book. It was anything but fulfilled. It didn't have any filling at all. It was vacuous and empty. And yet now, it's got all sorts of determinacy, like quality, quantity, measure, essence, central relation, absolute. All that stuff now are determinations of being that fill it up. He defines that. The concept that comprehends itself conceptually, being as the concrete and just as an absolutely intensive totality. Now, as usual in Hegel, the next paragraph down, he gives that another name. Nature. So in coming back to the beginning, we don't come back to it as it was in the beginning. Right? We come back to it at a significantly different determination, with determinations that it didn't have originally. And as he's repeatedly reminding us, they weren't there in hiding, right? These determinations, they weren't born there and we just had to pull them out. The unpacking of what was already there, the overflowing. No. This is genuine synthetic determinations that happen flowing along the immanent analytic unpacking, unfolding of that movement itself. So I would say then that and I'll come back and talk a lot more about nature in just a second. That's one of the first points about it, is that it's not something else. It's where we're at. But one of the things I think is important to remember for what Hegel's doing in terms of just at the level of systematicity, the level of what is a system, do we need to think of it as a closed hermetic circle back upon itself? Precisely not, for precisely this reason. When we come back to being at the end, we don't come back to it as it was. So we haven't really, we have returned to the beginning, but we haven't returned to the beginning as it was originally. So we haven't returned to that beginning. We've returned, to borrow language from others, we've returned to it with a difference. Right? It's repetition with a difference, as far as I can tell. So if that's right, then the circle of circles can't be a closed hermetic upon itself. It's got to be thought of more like a spiral. That's got to be much closer to what he's doing. That's why this openness happens at the end of each one of the circles, right? We're ending the circle of the logic at this point. But notice, when we come back to close the circle of the logic, we don't go back to the beginning of the logic, but we do, right? It comes back to that point again, but that point has now got determinacy that it didn't have when we first were here. So it's a different place, and that place has a new name, nature. As we'll see when we go through nature, right? Come back to the end of it, we won't come back to nature as it was in itself again. We'll come back to it as spirit. That's the spiraling of the circle of circles. Now, if that makes a little bit of sense about the method, we move from beginning to progression to, let's call it end, system. Hegel's claim then is that everything ultimately is systematic because it's just, we ought to present it as systematic because it is systematic in itself. This is just like that claim he made about syllogism. Syllogisms aren't just a way of reasoning. Everything that's rational is syllogistic in itself. Right? So literally the entirety of the world is syllogistic, right? Because that's the movement of the concept, which is, I don't know if you heard, everything. So that leads us to three things I want to examine here. It's three what I would call open questions, and I want to take them as open questions and think about them with you for just a few minutes, and hopefully they will generate other topics for us to discuss. One we're going to spend quite a bit of time on, that's the second one. And then the third one, if we get to it, we'll try to take off from there, but I'll open up discussion more broadly and we can talk more generally. Here's where I get to say, so what do you guys think? So I'm warning you that's coming. And I'd love to hear what you guys, honestly think at this point, if you're not completely exhausted, which I appreciate. For all sorts of reasons, not just Hegel, but that's enough. All right. So here's the three open questions or topics, open topics I want to consider. The first one is, what's the relationship between logic and nature? That's what we just heard about. And that's what really consumes these, page and a quarter that you've got at the end of the logic, is really this famous transition. I always say that way because the transitions in Hegel are not one thing moves into another thing. But that's the frustrating damn thing, right? It would be better if quality, kind of did what it did and then you left it behind. You now have quantity, right? This other thing. But Hegel says quality thought through in its truth just is quantity, right? And then he says quantity thought through in its truth is quality and quantity in measure of one another. So it's just measure. So it's not this movement over from one thing to the next thing. That's the sequentiality of reading Hegel as sequential in this way always bears the danger of thinking, well, there's this other thing that, I don't know, is other than the first two things or other than the first thing that was before it. And you'll be disappointed, right? Because I remember when I was in grad school working on the philosophy of right, and I thought, philosophy of right's structured this way. It's got this abstract right at the beginning, it's immediacy. It's got this development called morality. So there's the progression, works just like this, brilliant. And then you get to ethical life, Sittlichkeit at the end of it. So there you go. That's the way that works. And so ethical life is a third, to which they, transition. But what he literally says when he's making the transition from morality to Sittlichkeit is, what you come to at the end of morality is the recognition that both morality and absolute and abstract right are part of one thing. You go, okay. And he says, that's indeterminate. Okay. I get why it's indeterminate, because you separate them out and they can't stand on their own, but together they're necessary, but they have no determinacy. And then he goes, yep, and that's Sittlichkeit. Wait a minute, I thought Sittlichkeit was this other thing that was going to take care of the problem here. No, it just is that thing. So there's not transitions like we tend to think of in Hegel, like you might think a transition should be. It really is this third moment. Those who are counting at home, the third moment is really not a third moment, it's the first and second moment in their truth. So we'll get to that here again, logic and nature, same sort of issue. So we'll talk about that. Then the second one that we'll spend some time with, because I know this has been percolating under a lot of our discussions and come up several times, is the relationship between logic and language. That's what the handout is there to help me at least have some references to. I don't think it solves all the problems, but I want to take up the criticisms that we started the class off with in terms of the ineffable and the immemorial in its linguistic formulations. We'll look at them there and look at two veins of thought about that, about language in terms of the ineffable, language in terms of the immemorial, that Hegel was very well acquainted with, and we can talk about what he was doing, thinking about language in those terms. As I said last week, and I've said several times, hinted about this before, so now I've got to pay off on it at least a little bit, is the key to for Hegel to be able to do what he needs to do with language is to have a non-representational account of language. We'll see. That'll be the issue. We'll go straight to that there. And that takes us to the preface, right? Because there's that line in the preface, I've got it on your handout, where he says the logical forms are stored in language, stored in Sprache. Right? So what does that mean? Then finally, the rest of the preface, remember he writes this on November 7th, 1831, so just a week before he dies. He's made revisions to the first part, the logic of being. He's made revisions to that. That's what we have that we read as translated. He didn't live long enough to make revisions to the logic of essence or the logic of the concept. So those he didn't touch. Those are all from 1813, 1816. But the first volume is, as we have it translated, is really from 1831. So it's kind of a strange book, right? You're reading these first section of it is 1831 revisions, and then 1816, and it would be better, right? So we already have an 800-page book, I'm sorry. It would be better if we had the original 1812 edition of that, right? Rather than the 1831 edition of that. And we can at least compare the passages as he changed them for reasons that he changed. They're quite different in a lot of ways. So anyway, we'll look at that. But he addresses there at the end of that preface this question of logic and the mundane, logic and the everyday. So he's talked about all these concepts, these categories. He says they have a systematic conceptual valence, a logical valence, but they also, a lot of them have just an everyday usage. And so how does logic relate to the everyday? He's already introduced it by talking about they're stored in Sprache. These forms of thought are stored in language itself. Well, we use language representationally all the time. So how does logic relate to the representational is the way you can hear that. It's a rich thematic to think about through. We'll do that. All right, so give me just a few minutes then to work our way through logic and nature, and then we'll take a break and come back and look at the other two problems. So he says on 752, the beginning of the second full paragraph. So this is now this is 253 in the German. He says there, the idea, namely in positing itself, everybody see the second full paragraph down on 752, 253 in the German. The idea, namely in positing itself as the absolute unity of the pure concept in its reality. That's the idea, the absolute idea. And thus collecting itself in the immediacy of being, which he's just reminded us in the previous paragraph, that the idea is being, fulfilled being now. Being. He says, is in this form as totality. So he just told us when you come to the completion of a deduction, completion of a proof unfolding, that thou should have a system before you. He thinks you've got a totality. What's the totality that you have? That's what he calls it. Nature. So as I read what Hegel just did is to say, we've reached the end of the logic. The end of the logic returns to its beginning is being, but we don't return to it simply as it was. We return to it as it now is. And what it now is with all the determinations that have been demonstrated of it by this unpacking of or unfolding of determinations of being throughout all the analyses we proceeded through in the logic itself. So now it's fulfilled being, not empty being. That's the way of contrasting, right? So we come back to the beginning. And then he says, but we come back to the beginning with a difference, fulfilled being. He says, well, what's the name for that? Nature. So again, right, this boogeyman out there in the secondary literature of how do we make the transition from the logic to nature? Oh my God, the nature is formal and abstract and nature is concrete and real. How do we get the two to meet? Hegel doesn't know a damn thing about it. That's not the way Hegel thinks of the relationship between the logic and the real philosophy, the nature and spirit sections of the system. He thinks we're already dealing with the real, just the real at the level of ontological. Now we're going to look at it as it determines itself. And how does it determine itself? As fulfilled being, ultimately. Concrete, determinate being. Well, what is that? Well, we've now moved to one level up, you could say, or to one more of our spiraling out, one more circling around. And what's the circle around this time going to be? Nature. So we deal with nature. Now, he does call it, so let's acknowledge some things here. He does call it a decision. He speaks of the move from idea to nature as a decision. So it seems quite plausible. He does that in the rest of this paragraph we were looking at. It seems quite plausible to claim that what Hegel is doing here is turning from conceptual possibilities. This is how the logic is oftentimes read. He's turning from conceptual possibilities. That's what all this is. Conceptual possibilities. He's starting from that to the realm of contingent actuality. You know, the domain of nature. He's turning from logic, the logical, to the real. But that suggests that what is going on at the end of the science of logic is that thought now realizes that what it is missing, lacking something, is a realm that is radically other than thought itself. A realm of otherness or alterity that is extrinsic to thought, outside thought. And nature just is that alterity. It's a content, nature, right? It's not how Hegel's talking about it, but this is how this is often presented. It's a content that is somehow outside or beyond its form. It's extrinsic to its form, the concept. Now, interpreted in that way, and that's precisely, just to recall this, how Schelling interpreted it in Berlin in 1842 and 1843 lectures, where you have famously Kierkegaard, Engels, Feuerbach, Marx, Bakunin. They're all sitting out and listening at various different points. Engels leaves pretty soon, so does Kierkegaard. They don't hang around for all the lectures, but they got this point pretty clearly out of it, right? That the logic is telling, particularly the conclusion. So the beginning and end of the logic are telling for Schelling, right? The beginning of the logic says we start with indeterminate being. Well, you can't possibly do that because you already have to presuppose being to get going. There's his first claim, right? So these lies, these misportrayals that Schelling accuses Hegel of, that's the first one, right? That you can begin with indeterminate being. No, you can't. You always have to presuppose being. Existence has to be taken for granted. You know it through other means other than conceptual or rational, but that's how you know. He says, well, just like that exposes one element of Hegel's lie. The second one comes at the end, most clearly at the end. So, Schelling's I'm being a bit blunt and farcical about this, but it does make the point. It's as though he walked in and says, I got two lectures to deliver on the logic of Hegel. One's on the beginning, the other's on the end. Sorry, we're not going to deal with the stuff in the middle, right? Because that's, irrelevant, because the stuff at the beginning and the end tell us what the problem with the book is. The problem with the book is that it portrays itself as something other than what it actually is. What it actually is an analysis of conceptual possibilities that could or could not apply to reality. Where is that exposed? At the beginning, where it takes for granted something it can't take for granted, but yet it must. And at the end, where it confesses, the logic's going to have to be tied up some way. These abstract forms of essence and concept and whatever are going to have to be tied up to the reality of the natural world. That's Hegel admitting, confessing that the logical categories are abstract and need content from beyond themselves. That, to put it in terms we used earlier, form doesn't engender its own content. So Schelling would say at that moment that the best you could say about the logic, this is if you wanted Schelling to give you some praise of the logic, then he would say this: it's a negative philosophy. Schelling at this point in his career, 1840s, has drawn the distinction between negative philosophy and positive philosophy. And negative philosophy says, here's what the conceptual possibilities are, and that's all we can do. Positive philosophy goes beyond negative philosophy, says Schelling, and actually knows being itself. But that's we have access to, he says, only through modes of intuition that we find in myth and religion. So 1840s Schelling is all interested in not so much the natural sciences as he was back in the middle part of his career, Schelling, but now at the end of his career he thinks that mythology and religion are the access points to being that is presupposed, that lies beyond conceptual determination, that lies beyond reason. Put it in those terms. So the negative philosophy that's the best you could say about this book. Right? It's a ton of negative philosophy that doesn't know that it's negative philosophy. That's his problem with it. Right? That's Schelling's problem. This is all fine if you will say. The caveat is, yeah, but we don't know how it applies to the world. We're not going to make that hubristic claim. We're just going to say, here's how a bunch of categories entail one another. They're strung together in this way, and that's our claim that they do, entail one another in these ways. But we're not making the crazy claim that that's the way reality is. That's the negative philosophy reading of it. That is, it's an account. The book is an account under Schelling's reading of what it would be to exist, whatness, but is not itself an account of that existence, not of its thatness. Now, that's not how Hegel understands it. Hegel's not saying in the first paragraph on 752, okay, we've now returned to being, and being is fulfilled being and wasn't fulfilled being when we were first here, but now it's got determination and concreteness. He's not saying, okay, there's that, and now we got to link that up to something in the outside world. And we're linking that up in the next paragraph to nature. As I read him in those two paragraphs, he's asserting better an identification between the two. Fulfilled being just is nature. So I want to look at 2 points here. The first of which is that nature is not something other than being. It just is being when it's fully determinate. So the conclusion of the logic is that the concept is everything. What that means is that being is fulfilled now. And what that is just nature. So in the idea, this is about being, fulfilled being as nature. In the idea, being is absolutely self-relating. It is brought back to itself in and through its becoming other. The move from being to essence to concept is the return of being to itself. It's circling back upon itself. The end spirals back to the beginning, but it spirals back with a difference. What is the difference? Being with which the science of logic began has been now enriched, fulfilled by its immanent negation. Essence is the first immanent negation. We could talk about the sub-negations, right? Quality into quantity and to measure, but let's deal with the big ones. So being is negated by essence. And then essence is negated again by concept. There's the negation, and the negation of negation, there's the first negation, second, third. So consequently, it is no longer simply immediacy, We've begun with a simple immediacy, that's what being was. But it's now mediated immediacy. A fully concrete totality of relations produced by a fully rule-governed generative process. As such, the idea is concrete, determinate being. And this is no longer simply being itself, but being as nature, just being that is nature. As a result, strictly speaking, but as I said earlier, this is really true throughout the system, the idea does not transition into, it doesn't pass over into nature. It doesn't work as the logic of being operates. It doesn't one thing pass over into another. Nor does the idea posit nature, as we see in the logic of essence. It's not a positing relationship either. It just is nature. So he says here, the idea freely determines itself. That's where we get this language of it decides. It freely determines itself. That freedom is the freedom of the concept. Self-generative, self-causative, self-determining of the concept. It determines itself. The idea determines itself to be nature. It doesn't sit around and decide that. This is not God deciding, I'm going to be nature now. This is the process of determination inherent within the concept itself. It others itself, and it others itself into determinacy, and that determinacy just is nature itself. more about the othering in just a second, obviously. But he says, at the completion of its logical determinacy, then, the idea recovers the immediacy of being, comes back to that moment, the immediacy of being, and shows itself to be what is now fully determinate, what is now concrete. So it's not immediacy and immediacy anymore. It's mediated immediacy. That's nature, not being it. Nature is therefore not outside or beyond the concept. Nature is rather nothing other than the concept, or the idea. You can use them interchangeably. And the idea or concept as fully determinate being. So that's the first thing to say, right? Nature just is the concept, and it is being rendered as it is by the concept. Now, he also says, this is on 753 now, this is 3 lines up, down from the top. So he says, this is the passage I alluded to a moment ago. The transition is to be grasped, therefore, in the sense that the idea freely discharges itself. So it's a weird transition. You don't move over to something else. It freely discharges itself. It freely releases itself. Discharges, I don't love that as a translation. It releases itself releases itself, absolutely certain of itself and internally at rest. On account of this freedom, the form of its determinants is just as absolutely free. What does that mean? Well, it others itself. That's what the moment of releasement is all about here. It's about the othering of the concept, the concrete being, fulfilled being, othering itself. What is that? The externality of space and time. We've been wanting this since page 1. Where's time? Where's the temporal flow? We've been having this process going, and that looks to have stages and moments, and that's all temporal language. So how in the world don't we already have time here? And Hegel's saying there's a process that's ontological that precedes both logically and ontologically time and space. So the othering of fulfilled being, the externality of that, is the name for nature in externality. So Hegel will start out the philosophy of nature by saying nature is defined as the idea in its externality. The idea in its externality. That's why it is space and time. Now he has a long discussion at the beginning of the philosophy of nature about what that is, how you get spatial dimensionality out of that, how you get temporal dimensionality out of that, all that kind of wonderful stuff. And all that's derived through determinate negation, not through, now we got empty space out there, we can go put stuff in. No, you've actually got to derive that. Same thing about time. The whole temporal structure is something that has to be generated. It lays out an argument for that. All that's in the philosophy of nature for him. It doesn't belong in logic, but it's all working according with the development of the concept. It's working in the same terms. So he says, the form of its determinants is just as absolutely free. The externality of space and time absolutely existing for itself without subjectivity. So in case you want to say this is the doing of some being, be it divine or human, it's not. It's the unfolding of determinate negation. When determinate negation is given you fulfilled being and it others itself, it releases itself, what does it give you? Not being again, and not fulfilled being again, but fulfilled being in its otherness. And what's that? Space and time. So he says, let's continue on in 753. Inasmuch as this externality is only in the abstract determinants of being and is apprehended by consciousness, it is a mere objectivity in external life. So, you can turn this into a epistemological problem and say, how do I know that? That's what he's saying. You can think about it as something other than you and try to grasp it and comprehend it. That's when you have an epistemic relationship to nature. But notice what he's saying. Within the idea, however, which is where we're at here, it remains in and for itself the totality of the concept. Nature is. Not externality. It remains within the concept itself. And science in the relation of divine cognition to nature. It remains in and for itself the totality of the concept, and science in the relation of divine cognition to nature. So this is the perspective of absolute knowing. It's like divine cognition. It knows things as they are in themselves. But what is posited by this first resolve, here's what usually gets translated as decision, so it sounds like God's made a decision to do this, of the pure idea, that's what's done there, to determine itself as external idea, is only the mediation out of which the concept as free concrete existence that from externality has come to itself, raises itself up, completes its self-liberation, self-emancipation, in the science of spirit. So it goes to nature, it comes back to itself, ultimately in the science of spirit, philosophy of spirit. And in the science of logic finds the highest concept of itself, the pure concept conceptually comprehending itself. So here's where all that began, right? So here's that relationship we've talked about a little bit before that Hegel is constantly coming back to. What's the relationship between the logic, philosophy of nature, and philosophy of spirit? It's the last thing he says. So the self-othering of the concept, when you've reached the fulfilled being, that's nature, and it must be nature defined as the idea in its externality, because it's the othering of the concept itself, of itself. And that gives you space and time. And why that's the case, he doesn't answer. Or why space and time? You have to look at the philosophy of nature to see that case made. Okay, so that's, yeah. So that's the logic and nature setup. Let me, we're going to take a break here, so I'm not going to be long about this. I just want to set up the logic and language question. So logic and nature, does that make some sense? Okay. So one of the standard things that people say about the end of the logic is, haha, we now see it's all revealed. The logical categories are abstract because now you need to reach out and find how they can apply to this thing called nature. I don't know how you read those passages. I just literally don't know how you read them. Hegel is saying almost the exact opposite, if not exactly the opposite. Not almost, exactly the opposite. That nature is not outside the concept, it is the concept in its externality. That's what it is, because of the status it's attained. Okay. So take a look at me on the handout. This is also in the textbook, book as well, text. This is page 12 in the Science of Logic. This is in German 21, volume 21, this is on page 10. He makes this famous statement in the preface of the second edition. So, I think it's worth emphasizing, this is why we're reading the preface of the second edition at this point. This is at the end of Hegel's career. We were reading stuff from the almost, not quite the beginning, 1807 is where the beginning of mature Hegel. We're reading stuff from 1812, 1813, 1816, right? That's the material that we're reading, although it's been revised, the first part of it as I've described. But this is Hegel thinking back on what this book did. And it's really interesting in this period of his life because Hegel, he's written the encyclopedia at this point. He's got two revisions of that encyclopedia. So there's a third edition of the encyclopedia is published in 1830. So he's, if you want his tome, his masterpiece, his opus is out there, it's done. But he goes back in the last couple of years and he says, I think I need a new edition of the Phenomenology and a new edition of the Science of Logic. These two early works that he did. And there's a lot of speculation around why was he doing that, what's going on there. We can talk about those biographical facts if you like. But when he's doing it, it's interesting because he reflects on what he's done. And he goes back and he makes changes. He makes changes in the introduction to the phenomenology that are important. That's where he introduces the language of, talked about in other contexts, about moving from the ladder to saying the ladder is already within you. So he's clearly reflecting on what's the significance of these two early works. He clearly hasn't abandoned them. Many people who go to the encyclopedia and say, here's the systematic Hegel, will oftentimes say, well, he's really jettisoned these two early works, or at least the phenomenology, he's gotten rid of it. He still likes the logic maybe. But when he's going back to both of them, he says, he has a different perspective on both their function and what's going on in them. And one of the things that's interesting about the preface is this remark he makes there about language, because in that intervening period, he's become more intensely aware of what was generally called the metacriticism of reason. He knew this piece, right? This little piece by Hamann, it's maybe a page and a half long, where Hamann is laying a metacritique on the purism of reason, right? It's his response to or parody of the first critique. Right? He's literally reading Hamann is living in Königsberg. He's a good friend of Kant, and Kant's literally saying he's writing the first critique. He's handing Hamann the works he's doing before it's getting published, and Hamann's reading it and going, "Oh my God, this is crap." That's his response to it. But what's the crap there? Well, he thinks that Kant has an inadequate view of language and the magical, mystical, mystic ways in which language actually operates. Right? So Hamann has this wonderful way of thinking about the Eucharist and language, words, as doing the same thing. Right? They're both forms of transubstantiation for him. So he really thinks that language, he entered into a debate with others at this point with Herder about what's the origin of language, and Herder famously said, it's human, it's human, it's human, right? This is the Rousseauian point. And it all comes from our guttural utterances. This is the first discourse, or I forget, second discourse, prize essay on the origin of language. And then So Condillac is the other person back in the argument with Rousseau who says, no, it comes from God. And Haman's like, it comes from God. Right? When we have language, we're giving a divine gift. And so we can see what it does. And so he always will say to Kant, what he says in the Metacritique on the Purism of Reason, is Kant has, in order to do what Kant does, he has to purify things, extract from them their historicity. And that's what he's done. He's abstracted out language from its historicity. And yet that's what makes it possible to do the things that he does in the First Critique. So Kant is dependent on language and yet denies it, or at least is blinded to it. Because there's no, I mean, where's the theory of language in the First Critique? Good question. It's nowhere to be found. And so Haman's saying, it's not there for this reason. Well, Hegel's aware of that, right? He's aware of it in its Hamatian form, right? Because he's written a review during this period of Haman. He knew it because the Metacritique of the Purism of Reason was never published, but it was circulated all over the place. So there's plenty of all the intelligentsia of Germany at the point that time all knew that little short piece in some version of it or another. And then Herder famously published a book, long treatise really, on what he called the Metacriticism of Reason, right? So the Metacritique. And so that term was in use and was used by both Herder and Hamann. And Hegel knew all that stuff, right? So he refers to it. And when he goes back and looks at the science of logic, one of the things he says is, in essence, I take what this passage to be, is, I never really thematized how I did that. Sort of the same problem, right, that Kant has, that Hamann had pointed out. How are you doing that? How's language allow you to do that? What kind of language could you have that would let you do what you do in this piece? Aren't you presuming a lot? You're not supposed to be presupposing anything. Aren't you presupposing a lot about the malleability, the plasticity of language, that it could do these things? So here's what he says in this passage. And let me look at the passage and we'll come back and we'll take a break and we'll come back and look at what it does. So this is on your handout. The forms of thought, think from, right? So I take that to be his term for all these, I've got them listed up there at the top, at least a representative sample of all the concepts, the categories in the book. So those forms of thought, that list will suffice for the moment. He says, are first set out and stored in human sprache, in human language. Now that looks like he's going pretty far down the Hamannian route and saying, you got me. Down Herder's route, saying, you got me. Right? What I'm doing here presupposes this kind of, let's call it generally, cultural practice known as communication. And that cultural practice known as communication is either divine in origin, Condillac and Hamann, or it's naturalistic in origin, Rousseau and Herder. So it looks like he's gone down that pathway. But then look at what he says. And one can hardly be reminded often enough nowadays that thought, denken, is what differentiates the human being from the beast. Now, for all the problematic anthropocentrism that's there, right? So it's clearly there. What Hegel seems to be referring to at that point is a section, a part of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, where he draws a distinction between denken and those who don't denken, and who don't think. So this is really a distinction between between psychology and anthropology. And the psychology in the philosophy of the subjective spirit is really about this question, and ultimately about thinking. So he says, in everything that the human being has interiorized, thought about, right? And as you'll see after the break, not just thought about, but retains, holds on to. Interiorize means that. In everything that in some way or other has become for them a representation. That's his technical term for this. Forstellung is not just innocent in Hegel at this point. He's got a technical meaning for it. It means things that are worked up from empirical generalities, right? That's a representation, a depiction of something. And whatever they have made their own, whatever they think about, they represent, and whatever they have appropriated belongs to them. There has language penetrated. So language goes to the heart of everything. So he's going a long way with saying language is not something through which you merely, it's not a tool through which you merely express your thoughts. It's endemic to the thoughts themselves. So this is 1830, when he's writing this, 1831, when he's writing this. His main rival in Berlin at this point is Schleiermacher. And that's Schleiermacher's position. He's just articulated. So he's basically conceded the hermeneutics point that language goes to the heart of everything. Now, Schleiermacher takes it in a very different direction than Hegel's about to take it, but he's granting the point. Look, I agree with you, Schleiermacher. He's not quite saying that because they're deep rivals. The students couldn't sit in each other's classes, all that sort of stuff. They were bitter rivals. But this is Hegel saying, Schleiermacher, you're right. Language cuts to the core of thought itself. It's not ancillary, it's not secondary, it's not instrumental to thought. It goes to the very heart of thought itself. That's Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher thinks the same thing. But for Schleiermacher, that then becomes the project of interpretation. This is where we get, what Heidegger would eventually call the as structure. Everything is as something. Right? So we have to interpret it in some kind of way. Doing a hermeneutics. That's Schleiermacher. Heidegger picks up on this later. It's in Dilthey as well. I mean, it's not unique. But Schleiermacher is saying we have to interpret everything because it comes through language. And language bears a historicity. Here's where Schleiermacher goes down the route of Herder and says, oh, language is more naturalistic than it is divine. Strange because Schleiermacher is a theologian, but he doesn't think that language is divinely oriented. That's divine origin. It really is something we communicate through. It evolves and develops over time, and because it evolves and develops over time, it has all these associations by which we understand the world. Those are contingent associations. Well, if they're contingent associations, then how do we know the world, through the necessity of the concept? That seems to strike at the very heart of Hegel's project. So if he goes that far, if he goes down the route and says, language is at the very core of every single thing we think, and so that is what he's saying, right? At least what he's saying. And if he goes takes the further step that Schleiermacher is making and says, and that means we have to interpret it as something that's evolved over time and over history, and therefore it comes with all this accrued sedimentation. Well, then this book and the entirety of the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences is really just an interpretation of the history of thought. It really is all, as people like to say about it sometimes, the history of philosophy or the history of cultures, written in very abstract terms. But look at what Hegel says. In whatever they have made their own, there has language penetrated. Everything they transform into language expresses in it contains a category. Contains a category. Well, what's that category that's contained? What's the status of those categories? Right? Because that's the issue. What's the status of this category? He says, so everything that we think has a category built within it. Well, is that category fully linguistic? And is language nothing other than our depiction of the world and the set of sedimentations that come with that project of presenting the world, depicting the world? He says is, it contains a category, whether concealed, mixed, or well-defined. So much is logic natural to the human being. There's Hegel saying, look, I agree that language is fundamental, but what language bears within it, what it stores, is a set of logical categories. Well, we would ask, what's the status of those logical categories that are stored within language itself? What do we even mean by language here? If language is the repository of all these categories that we've been talking about, and language is nothing other than, as a repository of all those, they're associated with one another through historical association, then what looks to be claimed to be necessity here can't be. They're contingent. Right? They follow one another because that's what history says. I'm always reminded of Gadamer's reading of the opening of the Logic, where Gadamer says, you know why it's being nothing becoming? Because Parmenides comes before Heraclitus. That's literally his account, right? Because what Hegel's doing is redoing the history of philosophy, right? So he's going back to Parmenides, all is one, right? We cannot speak about the non-being. We can only speak of being itself. So the Parmenidean poem. And then where do we get becoming? Heraclitus. Well, of course that makes sense. Gadamer. That's the flow in the history. So yeah, that makes sense if you think Hegel is doing the project we just talked about, kind of Schleiermachian interpretive project of the historical associations and connections. But that's not what Hegel thought he was doing. So either this is an admission of, I did not do what I said I was doing, or it's something else. Obviously, I'm going to suggest it's something else, but let's see what that is. We'll see about that after the break, because all that hinges on this question about, is language for Hegel ultimately exhausted by its representationality? All right, we'll do that after the break. Let's take a break. It's 4:48. Thanks for being patient. 4:58, we'll be back in. Thanks.